How do you get an Endgame-sized finale? By making it a finale for every version of the same series all at once. Spider-Man No Way Home managed to do the impossible and lived up to most people's increasingly outsized expectations.
I will do this.
Not only that, but they managed to hide in plain sight that this no origin story superhero franchise was the origin story the whole time. How did they pull this off? What part of making this movie wasn't figured out by the internet ahead of time? Let's ask those who made it. If there's one thing that Spider-Man's foes have tended to have in common on the big screen, aside from hating Spider-Man, it's a talent for chewing scenery. And no one seems to take as much joy in chewing scenery than Willem Dafoe. Who can get that image of the Green Goblin's evil grin out of their heads as he took those spider punches? In interviews, co-stars Holland and Zendaya comment on how many choices Dafoe would be able to give directors, which ended in them reshooting scenes over and over again, just to see if he'd ever run out of different ways to do the take. Part of his ability to dig into the depths of his character was his insistence that he also do the physical stuff, including stunts. In an interview with Molderville, Dafoe said that doing the physical stuff was a requirement before he had even read the script, saying that it was an important element of getting into and developing the character.
I want to do the action because that's fun for me.
And, understandably, it's fun. Who doesn't want to cruise around on a goblin glider? Holland commented in an interview with Collider that after the two had finished filming a fight scene, both of them collapsed on the floor, having poured themselves into the scene, even getting Holland's knuckles bloody. It wasn't all high intensity on set. In fact, co-stars have remarked about how Dafoe was able to switch back to being his sweet, lovable self as soon as they called cut. But he wasn't the only on-screen baddie that brought some lightness to the set. During setup changes on some of the days that the movie's Electro were in, the multi-talented Jamie Foxx would hold his own dance parties with the producers and other actors.
He's just such a nice guy.
Were you there for the dance party?
I wasn't there for the dance party.
Even G&E would get in on the fun, setting up some dance lighting for their little parties. Here's a nugget for you to use at parties. G&E is Grips and Electric. Grips built the structure and apparatus for lights in production. Electric run the actual lights. They work under the gaffer, who designs the lighting assisted by the Key Grip for Grips and Best Boy for Electric. And now you know, which of course is half the battle. We'll tell you why it's called a honey wagon when you're older. There were two people notably missing from Fox's dance parties, stars Tom Holland and Zendaya. Zendaya revealed seriously in an interview that she had been asked not to visit set for a few days, in order to not distract production which was running behind. Since she felt her standing in the corner couldn't be what was holding things up, she came in eventually to find one of Fox's parties happening, with Holland adding that even he wasn't invited, and he's Spider-Man, in a Spider-Man movie. With one short of a Sinister Six villains returning from the other Spider-Man franchises, and two Spider-Men, sorry Nicholas Hammond, star of the short-lived 70s live-action series. Maybe next time. Spider-Man No Way Home was chock full of more than just cameos. But there's one cameo that ended up on the cutting room floor, and it's one with a very personal connection to star Tom Holland, Harry Holland. Brother Harry had co-starred in the non-Spider-Man movie Cherry. The brothers had entertained the idea of inserting his brother's character into Tom's movies, and that started with a small part in No Way Home. They even got as far as filming the scene, with Holland sharing a behind-the-scenes photo with his brother on his Instagram page. But the movie was already getting long and Harry's cameo ended up not making the cut. The younger Holland can join Hammond, consoling each other for not making it to the final product.
And my brother Harry is like, mate, you're Spider-Man, suck it up and get on with it, you'll be fine.
Comic book adaptations have solidified the important role in the life of a superhero.
Can I be your guy in the chair?
What?
While the superhero is out superheroing, the chair feeds them important information about the whereabouts of the bad guy, the status of the various first responders that come with having a super fight in a populated city, and if they can hack a few traffic lights, then all the better. Ned Leeds has been the MCU's man in the chair for Spider-Man since he caught Spidey crawling back into his room, destroying the Death Star for a third time. Maybe that's not the mega weapon it's meant to be. When Zendaya went for 60% sure to positive that Peter was Spider-Man, she joined the team, providing support for the superhero that also happens to be an awkward teenage boy. Team Spider-Man turns out to also be Team Holland as well though. If you were wondering why Zendaya was showing up on days she wasn't filming, it's because she and Jacob Batalon, who plays Ned Leeds, were providing emotional support to Holland as he filmed some of the movie's more emotional scenes, as so much of Peter's world came crashing down, both literally and metaphorically. To pull off the kind of eye-popping finale they did with No Way Home, secrecy was paramount, even if a lot of those secrets didn't stay secret. When Jamie Foxx announced his return as Electro, he posted an Instagram photo that also happened to feature 3 Spider-Men, launching 1,000 interview questions where an exasperated Andrew Garfield had to pretend he wasn't in the movie he clearly was in. Villains accidentally saying the quiet part out loud aside, there were a few secrets that were held closer to the chest, including the very emotional moment where Aunt May filled the inspirational role usually reserved for Uncle Ben. Aunt May actor Marissa Tomei certainly felt the weight of her role, in that key scene that has her saying one of the most iconic lines in all of superherodom. But thanks to her agreement with Sony and Marvel, she couldn't talk to anyone about it. That is, until she found a loophole. Therapists are ethically forbidden from sharing things their patients reveal to them. So Tomei was able to talk to her therapist about that moment without it getting out in the world. And now that it has, we all might need a little therapy to get over Aunt May going the way of Uncle Ben. With all that intensity, it might take more than Jamie Foxx dance parties to lighten the mood on set, and Tom Holland was there to provide with his own brand of practical jokes. Holland told the story of one joke of opportunity he was able to pull on Mitch Bell, one of the producers on Spider-Man. On Seth Meyers, he characterized Bell's role as being the guy watching the money, so he took the job of preventing a shutdown from an outbreak seriously. To get in and out of the tight-fitting suit, costumers used a lubricant to squirt on the zipper when it would get stuck. Lubricant that came in a bottle suspiciously like a bottle of hand sanitizer. So when Bell came by and asked for a squirt of that hand sanitizer, Tom and Brother Harry decided to take the opportunity to not correct him, and instead watch him futilely try to rub it onto his hands. A lot of things have changed since the first time Alfred Molina donned the Doc Ock appendages. Most of it in the technology that movies are made with. For Raimi's appearance of the Good Doctor, the extra appendages were a practical effect operated by puppeteers on set. Now it's a more digital age and the legs could be added in post-production, after filming with digital effects. That still required Molina to move about the set as if he were being carried by his mechanical legs. And that required what they refer to as the toothpick rig, a long balanced crane that allowed him to be moved about on set. While this meant that he didn't have to work in cooperation with 4 different puppeteers at the same time, it didn't mean that he was the master of his own fate, as the control of the crane was in the hands of the crew. This provided for some humorous moments between the actor, who is affable and friendly when he's not on camera menacing Spider-Man. During an appearance on Hot Ones, Holland revealed that he'd be talking about what part of England they're from, and suddenly Molina would start floating off into position for the next shot.
Hello, Peter.
One of the biggest strengths of the Sam Raimi Spider-Man movies was his clear love for the character and his dedication to a near-picture-perfect adaptation. Part of that came in the form of casting, including the practically ripped from the page Rosemary Harris as Aunt May, and the too perfect to be believed casting of J.K. Simmons as J. Jonah Jameson. The one foe that Spider-Man never can seem to defeat was a highlight of that first film series, and fans rightfully felt that he could not be replaced. So when he showed up in the end credits scene of Far From Home, fans were elated. While the MCU's J. Jonah has some changes, like being an online news outlet instead of a paper, and the iconic flat top was gone. Simmons, himself a fan of his iconic character, drew the line at the mustache and cigar though. Smoking is a no-no in the world's largest purveyor of children's entertainment, but the stash? That had to stay, and Simmons fought to keep J. Jonah's iconic facial hair. All the returning cast members from other series had things they wanted in order to revisit their roles. Dafoe and Molina were intent on not just being cameos, that were nothing more than a cheeky nod to their former roles. But Fox had another request: no more blue. Not all comic book looks can translate to real-world costumes, usually in the form of elaborate cowls. Electro traditionally came with a lightning bolt design that surrounded his face. Rather than tackling that tricky translation, they went with the Earth 1610s version of the electric supervillain, who crackled with the electricity and giving him a blue hue. CGI'd electric blue comic book characters on the big screen have a tricky history, and Electro's look didn't go over that well, especially with the star who wanted to lose the blue for his return. For bonus points, they even found a way to momentarily replicate the cowl in a cool way. The returning villains and aliens in No Way Home did manage to be more than just cheesy cameos, instead playing pivotal roles in Peter Parker's transition from Boy Spider to Spider-Man, standing out of the shadow of Iron Man and the Avengers. Even J. Jonah played his usual role of making a difficult situation that much more difficult by inadvertently giving the Green Goblin the opportunity to take one more thing away from Peter. But while the other baddies had intense one-on-one scenes with Spider-Man and men, J. Jonah remained on the outside looking in, never actually meeting Holland during the shooting of the movie. Maybe he was invited to the dance parties though.
Now that the multiverse is making old Spider-Mans cool again, Spider-Men?
It's a great time to brush up on the last Peter Parker reboot before we get the last film in the current reboot before it's rebooted again after this one, as Tom Holland has expressed a desire to retire Tony Stark's Spidey suit for the quiet life in England. So let's sharpen our Spidey senses with some behind-the-scenes secrets from the Black Sheep reboot that only made Sony a pathetic $1.4 billion, The Amazing Spider-Man. How much do you think someone should be paid to play Spider-Man? 10 million? 20? Well, if you're Andrew Garfield, that number is way lower. Garfield was paid a relatively paltry $500,000 to star as Spidey in The Amazing Spider-Man.
I just did 80% of your job. Huh? That's how you were paying me?
$500,000? The movie ended up making over $750 million, so what gives? Well, coming off the heels of Spider-Man 3, which turned into a joke in and of itself, and being that Andrew Garfield wasn't a big movie star yet, it sort of makes sense. And I know what you're thinking. Tom Holland wasn't a big star either, but he made a ton. Actually, Tom Holland also only made $500,000 for his starring role in Spider-Man Homecoming, although with bonuses it bumped up to $1.5 million. And for Garfield, his contract stipulated that he would get $1 million for The Amazing Spider-Man 2, so we can't feel too bad. But that still doesn't hold a candle to the $7 million Tobey Maguire made for his starring role in the original Spider-Man, which he then negotiated up to $17.5 million for the next one.
I'll pay you the usual rate.
MJ, Spider-Man's iconic red-haired love interest, was conspicuously absent from The Amazing Spider-Man 2, but it turns out that she was actually cast and shot all her scenes for the movie, but was eventually cut. Who'd they cast? Shailene Woodley, best known for Big Little Lies and the Divergent series. But why did they cast her and shoot her scenes but then cut her? Well, if you saw The Amazing Spider-Man 2, you know it's already chock full of characters, and spoiler alert, 3, 2, 1. Emma Stone's character Gwen and Spidey's main love interest in the film dies in the third act. So, introducing a new love interest that soon probably would have left an even worse taste in viewers' collective mouths. In the comic book world, Brian Michael Bendis is highly celebrated. He's the main creator of the Ultimate Marvel Universe and came up with some very popular storylines for Marvel Comics, like Age of Ultron. So Brian was brought into The Amazing Spider-Man to decide one thing, something the internet has debated forever, and will always debate: organic web shooters or mechanical? For those of us who were pop culture conscious around 2012 when The Amazing Spider-Man came out, we remember how big a deal it was that they went from organic web shooters in the original trilogy to mechanical web shooters in this one.
Go web! Fly!
And the final decision went to Brian Michael Bendis. Before The Amazing Spider-Man, they sat me down in Amy Pascal's office with this big room full of producers and writers and directors, and she looked at me and said, "Organic web shooters or mechanical web shooters?" I said mechanical, and half the table said, "God damn it!" They were mad because I was clearly the deciding vote, even though I didn't know that. So when I see the mechanical web shooters, I feel a little happiness. I mean, mechanical web shooters are fine, but then we don't get the way too much fun and way too long discussion about things like, how many Big Macs would Spider-Man have to eat to produce that much web? Ah, the 2012s. As if Gwen and Spider-Man aren't enough of a storybook romance, the real-life romance that bloomed off screen gave it a run for its money. It took a little while to start up, as it didn't click until closer to the film's release, but when it happened big. According to Andrew Garfield, it was like I woke up when she came in. She was the last person to screen test, and I was so bored of it by then that I was mucking about. And then she came in, and it was like diving into whitewater rapids and having no desire to hang on to the side. And it makes complete and total sense. I mean, look at them. They're both very attractive, and Emma has one of the coolest personalities in Hollywood. And she didn't ruin it like Jennifer Lawrence. It's one of the reasons Emma Stone is so successful. Unfortunately, the romance didn't last forever, but it did last 4 years, which in Hollywood translates to about 100. But that's not the only Spider-Man romance to bloom between romantic leads. During the first Spider-Man movie with Tobey Maguire, according to Sam Raimi, they began dating during the first movie. They eventually broke up, though, before the second movie started filming, and given the fact that Tobey met his future wife in 2003, it looks like they dated less than a year. Fast forward to today, and it's 3 for 3. As of July 2021, it looks very much like Tom Holland and Zendaya are definitely dating, as they were seen making out in Tom's Audi. I knew it! There must be a vast Hollywood conspiracy of executives and PR people forcing co-stars to date to maximize profits. Or Spider people are usually young, hot, and single, and so is their co-star. Move over, Raya. There's a new place where celebrities can meet and date each other. Spider-Man movies. When I moved to Los Angeles, I made the shocking discovery that almost every show, no matter where it's set, is almost entirely shot here. Judge Judy? Los Angeles. Friends? Los Angeles. Even the quintessential New York show Seinfeld was shot here in LA.
You know, we're living in a society!
So very much on trend with other properties set in New York, Spider-Man was no different, being filmed mostly in Los Angeles, getting only what they absolutely needed in the Big Apple. Until The Amazing Spider-Man 2 came along and bucked that trend, filming its entire length in the city that never sleeps. They shot in Manhattan, Long Island, and upstate in Rochester and Albany. But despite this landmark decision, the film still fell flat, which just goes to show, gimmick or no gimmick, a good movie has got to start with a good script. Gwen Stacy's death is a big deal in the Amazing Spider-Man comics, and the filmmakers left in a bit of an Easter egg for extremely detail-oriented fans of the series. In The Amazing Spider-Man 2, as Gwen is falling to her death, they cut to a clock with its hands spinning out of control. But if you watch closely... You're right, Emma Stone just died, I'll stop. You'll notice the hands stop at 121, which is a reference to The Amazing Spider-Man issue 121, the night Gwen Stacy died. Fans of the comics will also notice she's wearing the same outfit as the comics during her fateful fall. Another bit of foreshadowing came at the end of The Amazing Spider-Man 1. After Spider-Man slings himself out of a crane, we can see the George Washington Bridge, which is where Gwen Stacy falls to her death in the sequel. It's kind of vague, but the film's animation supervisor, David Shobe, said it's foreshadowing. And honestly, who am I to question Shobe? Looks like the filmmakers behind the Amazing Spider-Man movies wanted to start up a Sinister Six storyline in the third film that never got made. How do I know? Look no further than the ending of The Amazing Spider-Man 2, where a shadowy man, later identified as the Gentleman, walks through a room with Doc Ock and Vulture's costumes. According to director David Webb, we were talking about the Sinister Six. They were going to make a Sinister Six movie before we did the third one, and then there was this character called the Gentleman. We had some notions about how to do it, but I think maybe we were thinking too far ahead when we started building in those things. Also, in an extremely odd, but also very awesome technology tie-in, if you opened up Shazam during the Alicia Keys song in the credits, a sequence of images would play on your phone, teasing the members of the Sinister Six: Vulture, Rhino, Doc Ock, Kraven the Hunter, Mysterio, and Green Goblin. Too bad it didn't work out. But don't despair, Sinister Six shippers! Spider-Man No Way Home is shaping up to be a potential Sinister Six vehicle, if Easter eggs from the trailers are any indication. We'll know soon enough. Maybe you already know because you're watching this in 2022, and aliens have invaded, so you have nothing better to do than watch YouTube videos waiting in your cell for the alien gruel. Oh well, still better than 2020. The Spider-Man series is no stranger to Venom teases, and The Amazing Spider-Man 2 is no different. In fact, I had a line in here about how the trailer clearly pointed to Venom being in the Spidey sequel, but then I took a look, and this is the proof.
This is my...
I don't know, pretty flimsy. But there were also some Easter eggs in the movie itself. When Harry Osborn is going through Oscorp's database of secret projects, always a treasure trove of Easter eggs, one entry is titled Venom Storage. Is it just regular Venom, or everyone's favorite symbiote? Fans speculated that because this universe has all the heroes and villains created right there at Oscorp, maybe Venom Storage is referring to the Spider-Venom that turned Spidey into a superhero, which they would then use to create Venom right there at Oscorp. This would also connect to the Ultimate Spider-Man comic, where director David Webb got a lot of inspiration. In it, Ben Parker and Eddie Brock's father researched and developed the Venom suit as a cure for cancer, and given the fact that director David Webb was anticipating 5 movies, it would fit in this universe and in the timeline. Other notable entries from the database are a reference to experiment Oct-32A, which refers to Doc Ock appearing 32 times in the Ultimate Spider-Man comic series, and another file titled Dr. Morbius, referring to Dr. Michael Morbius, who becomes Morbius the Living Vampire, another villain for Spider-Man, who actually got his own series. Morbius is just this year coming to the big screen with Jared Leto playing the titular role. And yes, he does have an extreme weight loss journey for this film too. We get it, Jared. You have an almost supervillain-like control of your fat cells. Now can you hurry up and get us some of that sweet weight loss DNA? Where's Oscorp when you need it? Dean DeHaan, who played Harry Osborn in The Amazing Spider-Man 2, is clearly jealous of Jared Leto's powers of weight control, as he really tried but didn't quite succeed. His Green Goblin suit was way too hot, and he suffered from heat exhaustion. They made a little system that pumped cool air into his suit between takes, but it did have a downside. I lost 7 pounds in 2 days of filming, which was pretty much all the weight I'd put on for the movie. Okay, well I do feel kind of bad. I feel like I've lost 7 pounds in 2 days before. Like 2 days after Thanksgiving, if I weigh myself right after dinner, then in the morning 2 days later, 7 pounds. Or if I spend 2 days at a music festival, 7 pounds. All very viable sudden weight loss scenarios, and nowhere near Jared Leto. Sorry, Dane. So, the Amazing Spider-Man universe is best known as a failure, but after looking into it a bit more, seems like a lot of media hype. The Amazing Spider-Man 1, which was universally considered a success, made $758 million worldwide. The sequel, which was universally panned as a failure, made $708 million. Sounds pretty good to me. What gives? Unfortunately, it's all about doing better than the last one. And the original Spider-Man series did gangbusters. The original made $821 million. The sequel made $789 million, and the third came in on top at almost $900 million. So when The Amazing Spider-Man came along and made less than any of the originals, followed by a drop in returns for the second, the studio decided to pull the plug. And it looks like it was a good decision, as Spider-Man Homecoming made a lot more than The Amazing Spider-Man, taking in $880 million, with its sequel blowing even that out of the water with a take of $1.1 billion big ones.
It's hard to believe that Sam Raimi's Spider-Man trilogy first swung into theaters nearly 20 years ago. Over that time, plenty of secrets behind the production of the films have been unearthed. I'm sure you've heard about the creative differences between Raimi and Avi Arad, which led to the bastardized Venom, or the web shooter Kerfluffle, which brought us, well, whatever this is. So what other behind-the-scenes drama occurred?
Sam, I won't be spoken to in that manner.
You talking back to me?
How were some of our favorite villains brought to life? Let's get to it.
Up and away with!
So Sony really watched Darkman and decided, yep, Sam Raimi is the perfect director for Spider-Man. Odd choice, but okay. Sam was one of many attached to the troubled production, which actually started its journey way back in the mid-80s. Canon Films had the rights to The Wallcrawler, and they were given 5 years to produce a movie or lose the rights. Radically shifting the source material, they would have gone with a much more horrifying route, literally adapting the Spider-Man title. To direct the Man-Spider film would be Tobe Hooper, you know, the guy that at the time was directing Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2. I'd have a joke here about that choice, but Sam Raimi did the Evil Dead films and hit Spider-Man out of the park, so maybe they were just ahead of the curve with that one.
Groovy.
That film never happened, and Carolco Films then received the rights, with James Cameron now set to be in the director chair for an R-rated adaptation that was an angsty allegory for puberty. If you were ever curious how Sony got the idea for the natural webbing, yeah, it came from this script and had a much different intention. In fact, the entire script is now publicly available. It's a wild what if. Carolco then went out of business as well, and thus came Columbia and Sam Raimi. Raimi had been a longtime fan of The Wallcrawler and had a definitive resume full of characters being thrown around all over the place. For what it's worth, Sam's ability to direct horror contributed to some pretty terrifying villains, and the series really wouldn't have been the same without him. Just like the troubled production history, the choice of who was to be under the red mask took a while to get just right. For the longest time during the Cameron adaptation, it was actually Leonardo DiCaprio who was in consideration for the role, but parted ways when the project fell through. Sony had plenty of actors in mind for who they wanted. James Franco, Heath Ledger, and Freddie Prinze Jr. all caught the studio's eye, but Sam Raimi had someone else in mind. After watching The Cider House Rules, Sam knew that Tobey Maguire just was Peter Parker. Considering all this was happening hot off the heels of the Schumacher Batman flicks, it wasn't an easy yes for Tobey.
I can't.
The studio didn't feel that Tobey could get in superhero shape, and Maguire himself had never read a comic. It was only after a talk with his childhood best friend, Leonardo DiCaprio, who convinced him to give the role a shot, and after a few weeks of intense workouts, Sam and Tobey shot a demo reel which convinced Sony execs that Tobey was perfect for the role. There is no doubt that this trilogy of films pioneered the CGI tech that future superhero properties would thrive off of. But it's because of the technological limitations that a lot of the stunt work had to be practical. The stunt department knew Spider-Man had to move unlike any other high-flying superhero that came before him, and it's because of this that the choreography actually became heavily inspired by an unlikely source, wuxia. Most recently, this high-flying fantastical form of martial arts was used in Shang-Chi. Here you could see the combatants effortlessly flying through the air in a beautiful dance that is entirely unlike any other hand-to-hand combat you've seen. Considering both Spider-Man and the Green Goblin are characters that rarely touch the ground, it makes sense that they took heavy inspiration from the historical literature of wuxia. Spider-Man features an impressive rogues gallery that Raimi clearly had a blast adapting, for the most part.
I like being bad. It makes me happy.
The Green Goblin was a shoo-in for the first film. Not only is he both Peter Parker and Spider-Man's mortal enemy, but the character himself is reminiscent of the demonic creatures of Sam Raimi's directing past. Seriously, that entire nightmare sequence kept me up so many nights. One of the jarring changes made in the first film was the Green Goblin's costume. The military design of Willem's costume was certainly different. Originally intended to be much more bulky, the costume was heavily simplified as Willem wanted to perform all of the stunts. It ended up comprising 580 pieces and even included Nike Air flight posits. To this day, the costume gets likened to a Power Ranger villain, and yeah, I totally see that. Oh man, could you imagine if this movie had introduced Leopardon? That would have been freaking amazing! There was a go at doing a faithful prosthetic design to the Goblin mask, looking quite a bit like the haunting imagery depicted in Alex Ross's concept art, but the studio felt that it was too creepy. Complete side note, but did you know that Willem wasn't actually supposed to show up in Spider-Man 2? He was just stumbling around New York when he bumped into filming, and the crew had such a fun time interacting with him again that they wrote him back into the script. While the 2002 Spider-Man faced a lot of production hurdles, the biggest head-scratcher for the sequel was how they could faithfully depict Doc Ock. While the technology was there to make the tentacles CG, Sam Raimi wanted each arm to be a realistic nightmare that would tangibly terrify audiences while also fully interacting with the world around them. The production crew even considered the arms to be their own character, with each having their own name. It's because of this that Tony Stark had to create the arms for real. I'm only half joking there. Originally, Stark Industries was name-dropped as the creators of the tentacles, but it had to be taken away due to legal reasons. Edge Effects was the real company that created the arms. In the end, they were 13 feet long and weighed a total of 60 pounds altogether. Each arm was puppeteered, and to have it look like Alfred Molina was using the tentacles to walk, he was suspended up to 20 feet in the air. The crew absolutely loved the arms and tried to include them in as much physical shots as possible, with the only time they were CGI was when it was entirely necessary for the stunt. I'm definitely not the first to state that the villains in Spider-Man 3 were a letdown. The new Goblin took years of development, only to get mind-wiped in the first scene. And Sam Raimi really didn't want Venom to be in the movie. It's because of these two that a true gem gets buried in the sand. That's right, I think Thomas Hayden Church's Sandman is wildly underrated. He's got some great visuals combining practical and visual effects, and he's just played so earnestly. As inspiration, Thomas based his performance on misunderstood monsters like King Kong and Frankenstein's monster. Sure, these beasts leave a trail of murder, but that was never their goal. It's an interesting turn versus the previous villains who became bad because their experiments made them go crazy. Given Raimi's horror background, it makes a lot of sense that he included Sandman in the original treatment. Not included in the original script? Venom. Vulture was supposed to open the movie as a character that gets quickly dished out in the opening action set piece, only to come back at the very end to tease the sequel. Even though James Franco was already a villain in this movie, they felt that the movie was missing a millennial, and thus came Topher Grace, who, funnily enough, was actually in contention for the role of Peter back in 2002.
Pack your things. Get out of my building.
I was just...
You're fired!
It took a decade for a Venom to be adapted that satisfied fans in all his cheesy 90s delight. But a lot of good did come out of what we got because of Spider-Man 3. Creating the digital symbiote was a challenge for the VFX crew. It's one thing to see the design on paper where it seldomly moves, but actually creating a satisfying movement was difficult. The very first scene that was storyboarded with the symbiote was when it was attaching itself to Spidey. E.J. Chrysler storyboarded the sequence and did so in such a striking way that the moment they seen his frames, the VFX team knew exactly how the goop would move. Now, all these years later, the symbiote still acts the same way in Venom Let There Be Carnage. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. As discussed before, the failed adaptations of Spider-Man were always intended to be dark. The Tobe Hooper film would have been a straight-up horror movie, while the James Cameron treatment was aiming to be hard R with its violence and sexual content. Even today, people are still clamoring for a rated R Spidey film, with fans being disappointed that Venom hasn't received an R rating. As it turns out, Spider-Man 1 actually almost became an R-rated film. During the final fight where Peter is getting squashed like a bug, the VFX team had to change the color of the blood flying out of Toby's mouth to make it look like spit instead. You know, that movie also had people disintegrating into skeletons, but it's the blood that was the issue. Okay.
Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse is probably the best comic book movie of all time, in the sense that it is basically a comic book come to life. To pull off this amazing and unique style, a crazy amount of effort went into the animation, and that's why in this video we're going to take a look behind the scenes of the movie so we understand just exactly how it was made, looking at all the animation secrets, interesting tidbits, and some fun anecdotes. Let's take a look. Spider-Verse, whose existence became known due to the infamous Sony hacks, was definitely a passion project for both the producers Phil Lord and Chris Miller, and the two put their hearts and souls into making the movie such a success. Part of the influence of the movie came when the two of them were walking down Olvera Street, an outdoor marketplace in historic downtown Los Angeles, when they noticed the amount of people wearing Spider-Man masks. Along with a line said by the legendary Stan Lee, this moment inspired them that anyone could wear the mask, and this became the driving force behind the movie, saying that they wanted to inspire young people to become heroes, inspire grown-ups to help them do it, and remind us all that you don't need to be bitten by a radioactive spider to do your part. You are powerful and we are counting on you. Visually, the duo wanted to immerse the viewer into the spectacle of the movie and make them feel like they were actually watching a comic book come to life, combining the latest computer-generated animation technology with hand-drawn artistry. They said, "It was very important to us that every frame of the movie was refined by the artist's hands after the visuals were rendered by computers. If you freeze any part of the movie at any time, it will look like an illustration with hand-drawn touches and all." But of course, this was no easy feat, and you just need to ask the likes of Hayao Miyazaki how much attention to detail goes into hand-drawn animation. This meant that the movie needed 180 animators to complete the project, which was the largest crew ever put together by Sony Animation Studios on a movie. It's not just manpower the production needed, but buckets and buckets of time.
You're late.
Again, just ask Miyazaki how much time goes into making an animated movie. Which, by the way, Mr. Miyazaki, if for some crazy reason you happen to be watching this video, if you could finish How Do You Live soon, I'd really appreciate it. But, you know, no pressure or anything. Anyway, for an animated movie, it can sometimes take animators like a week to create just a 4-second sequence. And for Spider-Verse, because the animation style was so involved and sophisticated, it took on average 4 times as long to animate a second than it typically does for CG animated films. This meant that it sometimes took the animators a month to create a 4-second sequence, which in an industry where time is money is an absolute fortune. Thankfully for them, the movie was an absolute Oscar-winning success. Otherwise, I imagine there would have been some pretty harsh words thrown around at Sony. To create that comic book aesthetic, art director Dean Gordon said, "We broke down gradations and color values into areas and created shorter transitions between them to get a more illustrative feel in the scenes." They also played with lighting, or lack thereof, as another way of making the film seem more comic book-like, with art director Patrick O'Keefe saying, "We used dark shapes with just glimpses of light to describe them." It really extended the range of what we could and did put up on the screen. Another way they paid tribute to old comic books through the visual style was to imitate the imperfections of offset printing to give it that authentic comic book feel. To eliminate motion blurs, there were portions of the film that were run at 12 frames per second instead of the typical 24 frames per second. And there are also great chunks of the movie where Miles animates at 12 FPS, showing his inexperience as Spider-Man until he starts to grow into the role and becomes animated at 24 FPS. Another animation technique the production used was the use of Kirby dots during the Collider sequence, as they not only reminded the animators of spray paint, but also served as an ode to the legendary comic book artist Jack Kirby. For the interdimensional quakes, the artists employed the use of cubism, with art directors Dean Gordon and Patrick O'Keefe saying that the style acted as a natural metaphor for the multiple universes converging. One of the most challenging sequences in the movie comes during the scene where Miles and Peter are attached to one another during a chase, but the team seemed to relish the challenge. Head of story Paul Watling said that the sequence was a story artist's dream, going on to say, "The filmmakers weren't pulling any punches. They kept encouraging us to go further, and we pushed ourselves as much as possible. We threw everything we possibly could at them in terms of camera angles, moving frames, comedic elements, police cars hot on their trail to add this sense of urgency, as well as slapstick elements added on." In terms of style and theme, the one scene that really inspired the rest of the movie was the moment where Miles and his Uncle Aaron create some Great Expectations-inspired graffiti art underground, and this sequence was one of the first completed during production. Speaking of sequences, the What's Up Danger sequence where Miles takes his leap of faith was initially labeled Rise Up, a reference to Lin-Manuel Miranda's musical Hamilton, which also follows a scrappy underdog. Also, the dramatic shot of Miles falling, which just so happens to be my desktop background, was actually one of the first written moments of screen direction in the script. Now, while the animation rightly gets a great deal of attention, the movie also happens to boast a killer score. To give that authentic vinyl sound, after all the musical elements had been recorded, they were then recorded onto vinyl and then re-scratched into the mix, with Daniel Pemberton, who created the score, saying, "I got a DMC World Scratch Champion DJ to scratch all the parts in." For Miles' theme, Pemberton used many different sound effects, such as an aerosol can, and blended them into one, while the bass for Prowler's signature siren noise was actually that of an elephant. And apparently the note given to Pemberton for the noise was that it should be frightening, yet hold a hint of sadness. And I have to say, the guy pulled it off.
Not bad, kid.
As you'll likely know, the movie makes a number of loving references to Sam Raimi's Spider-Man trilogy, but seeing as this is a behind-the-scenes video and not a Things You Missed video, I'm not going to dive too deep on them. One thing I will say, though, is that Peter B. Parker's messy divorce with MJ is actually a reference to Raimi's script for Spider-Man 4, which, of course, never made it to the screen.
They stole it from me, Carmine! They took it!
Which initially saw Peter and MJ getting married before eventually getting a divorce when it was revealed that Peter had an affair with Felicia Hardy. Raimi eventually changed his mind on this, but Sony canceled the project altogether as they didn't want to give Raimi the time to rewrite it. Also, before No Way Home made it cool, Spider-Verse actually pitched cameos from Tobey Maguire, Andrew Garfield, and Tom Holland, all playing versions of Spider-Man from different universes, but this was eventually nixed. However, Maguire was very nearly cast as the older Peter Parker, but Sony eventually decided against this too, as they figured audiences would find it confusing. Seriously, Sony, first you cancel Spider-Man 4, and then you stopped us having a Maguire cameo in the movie? Man, if Spider-Verse wasn't so good, you'd be on thin ice.
You want forgiveness? Get religion.
Another actor that was considered at one point was John Krasinski, but this was another casting that never came to fruition. Although, maybe we will see Spider-Jim in Across the Spider-Verse. Who knows? Now, when it comes to actors who did make it into the movie, Mahershala Ali, who provides the voice for Uncle Aaron and was one of the first actors to be cast, served as the direct inspiration for the way the character looked, with the animators taking some of his physical traits and turning them into something that reminded the audience of Ali, but was also original and avoided caricature. Lily Tomlin, who provides the voice of Aunt May, was actually the person Lord and Miller had in mind when thinking of the Aunt May they wanted to bring to the screen, so they were happy when she actually agreed to be in the movie. But the one actor who most inspired their character was Shameik Moore, who provides the voice of Miles, and the animators actually animated Moore's full performance in the role, such as the scene in the cop car with Miles' dad, which was recorded with them sitting in chairs set up like a car to give them the proper dynamic. Co-director Rodney Rothman couldn't emphasize enough how much of Moore's performance influenced the character, with him being blown away by one of Moore's early dialogue tests saying, "It wasn't about what Miles was saying, it was about how he was performing, and how the animators were emphasizing parts of Shameik's voice and the things he wasn't saying." When it comes to Moore playing the part of Miles, it is basically a case of him speaking it into existence, with Moore saying, "In fact, when I was a teenager, I wrote in my diary that one day I would play Spider-Man." It sounds like working on the movie was an absolute blast, and this was down in part to the creative freedom Lord and Miller gave to the cast and crew, with Jake Johnson admitting that a big reason he was drawn to the movie was because of the duo. Nicolas Cage, who was absolutely amazing as Spider-Man Noir, was happy about the amount of creative freedom he was given, saying, "It's no secret that I like to play with different sources. It was fun to go back in time and pull a little of that Humphrey Bogart essence." John Mulaney, who plays Peter Porker, was also given a lot of creative freedom. But this led to the actor dropping a ton of curse words into his performance, only to be later told that this movie had a PG rating. The only thing Lord and Miller learned on the cuff about one of their actors is that Chris Pine has pipes. The filmmakers were actually finishing up the score when they came up with the idea of doing a holiday album, and as soon as they heard Pine's voice, they immediately rushed into planning how to make the album. Now, onto a more somber note as we close out this video. The movie is dedicated to Spider-Man co-creators Steve Ditko and Stan Lee, who sadly both passed away before the movie was released. with Ditko passing away in June of 2018 as the movie was in post-production, while Stan Lee passed away in November of 2018, a month before the movie was released. This movie is actually the last ever voice role for Lee, with the filmmakers actually going to his office to record his lines, a luxury they gave to no other member of the cast. The movie pays tribute to both Ditko and Lee, with Steve Ditko being one of the contacts in Jefferson's phone, while not only does Lee have a small voice role, but because the animators wanted to animate him so much, they placed him subtly in almost every train in the movie. So, make sure to keep an eye out for him the next time you watch the film, because let's be real, you're gonna rewatch this film.
You know, I guess one person can make a difference. Enough said.
And finally, one complaint my buddy had over the film was that the movie's villain, Wilson Fisk, looks kinda weird. But the character is modeled after the Kingpin in the Daredevil Love and War graphic novel from 1986 by Frank Miller and Bill Sienkiewicz. Kingpin also happens to be one of Phil Lord's favorite characters, saying his physical presence doesn't leave room for anything else.
Fans of Spider-Man will of course know that the friendly neighborhood superhero can do, well, whatever a spider can. Is that scientifically accurate? Can spiders actually do backflips? Well, for the sake of argument, sure. If you've been bitten by a radioactive spider, you can do backflips. But actors, their only superpowers are their personal trainers. In this video, we're going to be looking at the most sensational stunts from nearly 20 years of Spidey movies. 20 years! What? No wonder Tobey Maguire's back hurts. My back! Oh, my back! Realistically, we were only ever going to start with Tom Holland. In the words of Marvel's executive VP of production, quote, Tom does things that are a little scary, and we encourage him not to because, you know, he could hurt himself, but as much as he can do, he will do, end quote. A trained gymnast and dancer, Holland is arguably the most physical of all these cinematic Spider-Men. He's been impressing everybody with his physicality since his debut way back in Captain America Civil War, and Spider-Man No Way Home is no exception. Whether it's doing a backflip off of a moving car, or hanging upside down in some crazy harness, or fighting the forces of evil, Holland is right there giving it the old college try. Dude can even run up a tree and backflip off of it. How many of those have you done lately, huh? Of course, there are some stunts that even Holland can't do, often for legal reasons, and for that, he has stunt doubles. In fact, the star recently made a point of publicly thanking his doubles for their efforts, praising them as legends, which is pretty cute. Possibly not so cute though is the time that, you know, Holland accidentally farted on co-star and girlfriend Zendaya immediately after a major stunt involving some scaffolding. I'm sure they can laugh about it now, of course. Of course, Holland has been going above and beyond since Civil War, but it goes even further than that. When he first auditioned for Spider-Man, he decided to throw in a backflip just to distinguish himself from the competition. Hey, couldn't hurt, right? And the actor's enthusiasm for stunts, whether that's jumping off of metal beams in Homecoming or jumping onto buses in Far From Home, that's changed the way Marvel and Sony do special effects sequences. Back in the Tobey Maguire days, the scenes of Spidey swinging from the New York skyscrapers were entirely CGI. But Holland is so physical, the VFX crew were able to map his movements using motion capture technology and integrate them into CGI scenes. The VFX supervisor, Theo Bialik, said, quote, if we didn't do direct capture, we still observed how he catches himself when he's off balance. He kind of recorrects or windmills his arms when he's in the air, and all that stuff is just so valuable because you catch on all those nuances. End quote. So while it is CGI, it's also, in a very real sense, Tom Holland. The magic of the movies, huh?
Yeah, basically.
Of course, the ex-Billy Elliot kid gets all the headlines when it comes to spider stunts, but Zendaya is no slouch in that department. the actress has a majorly expanded role in No Way Home, and as well as character stuff, this also involved some practical stunt work, which she said was so much fun. These stunts included her dramatic Gwen Stacy fall at the climax of the movie, which looks pretty perilous for both character and actress. But the other big example occurs near the beginning. MJ and Peter are fleeing from angry crowds after Peter is outed by J. Jonah Jameson, and Peter swings them up onto the top of New York's Queensboro Bridge. After a minute, they jump off again. Apparently, while filming the jump, the height difference between Zendaya and Tom Holland became a bit of a problem. Being a few inches taller, Zendaya kept landing first, which meant that Tom kept losing his footing, and his co-star had to catch him. Of course, theirs is a pretty equal partnership, so we're sure Mr. Holland's ego remains intact. Willem Dafoe has a reputation for intense performances, and he brought his A-game to the original Spider-Man and to his returning role in No Way Home. Not only does he chew scenery like a pro, but Dafoe insists on doing his own stunts where possible. In fact, he did something like 90% of his own stunts for the original Spider-Man, including scenes where he was wearing the Green Goblin mask. At the time, Tobey Maguire even commented to an interviewer that his villainous co-star was in ridiculously good shape. And hey, you would need to be flying around on wires and punching Spider-Man through walls. Now 66, Dafoe was equally keen to do his own stunts in the new movie. In fact, it was one of his main conditions for returning, because he considers the physical aspects of the performance to be just as important as dialogue. To make it even more impressive, Dafoe reportedly did more stunts for No Way Home than he did back in 2002. Now that, my friends, is commitment. Willem Dafoe may be happy to get his hands dirty, but Alfred Molina, aka Dr. Octopus, was a little less keen. The veteran actor who starred in Spider-Man 2 and returns for No Way Home quite reasonably pointed out that stuntmen are there for a reason, and he did not want to put anybody out of a job. He was also happy to admit that he wasn't very good at stunts, and he didn't want to hurt himself or anybody else, which seems fair enough to us.
I'm cacking my pants.
Of course, Molina did do some stunts, though a lot of that was limited to wobbling up and down in front of green screens.
If I were a rich man.
His iconic tentacles were also very real. The actor wore a corset with two girdles on top, and the tentacles attached to these, though they were remotely operated by the crew. The costume weighed something like 100 pounds, and Molina also had to be attached to a special rig for scenes where his tentacles were carrying him along. Now pushing 70, the actor had to be digitally de-aged for his role in No Way Home, and it doesn't sound like he's any more keen on doing stunts than he was back in 2004. Jake Gyllenhaal's performance as Mysterio was one of the highlights of Spider-Man Far From Home, and the actor certainly threw himself into the role. Apparently he loved his costume so much that he insisted on wearing it as often as possible.
Graham, let me ask you something. If they offered you that, would you ever take that off?
I would never take it off. I would never take it off.
Do you fly in this movie?
Yes, but I fly generally anyway.
Even in scenes where the filmmakers had planned for him to wear normal clothes, Gyllenhaal also made sure to get in shape for the movie. He and Tom Holland even went to the gym together during shooting, and their workouts got so competitive that Holland was left too sore to walk. And you know what? Physical stunts may be hard, but sometimes it's the little things that challenge actors the most. Gyllenhaal was so nervous on his first day that he kept forgetting his lines, and one simple dialogue scene between him and Holland required an insane 40 takes. And why? Because the two actors kept laughing. Way to keep it professional, guys.
You just laughed at my performance. You were looking around so far so you couldn't look at me, which made me laugh. Yeah.
Michael Keaton is no novice when it comes to superhero stunts. Come on, the guy played Batman. However, he was 38 when he shot that, and 66 when he played Vulture in Spider-Man Homecoming. And while the veteran actor was happy to get in shape and do as many stunts as he could, there was a limit to the level of physical action that he could pull off. And hey, he was wearing a big wing suit and a helmet that disguised his face, so why take unnecessary risks? In fact, Keaton actually recommended a stunt performer he'd previously worked with on Birdman to double him for his MCU appearance. Amusingly, during his downtime on Homecoming, Keaton practiced the stunts that he would have to do for his next movie, American Assassin. And the Spider-Man stunt team even helped him rehearse. Tom Holland, oh, Tom Holland. Hey, talented kid, sure, but he was not the first person to play Spider-Man. How about we show some respect to our guy Tobey Maguire?
I'm gonna put some dirt in your eye.
Maguire went through his fair share of physical exertions. He got ripped for the role, for one thing, and he nearly passed out when being body cast for his Spidey suit because he's claustrophobic. He also ended up coughing and choking during the iconic upside-down kiss scene with Kirsten Dunst because he had water running down into his mouth and filling up his sinuses. Not very sexy. Plus, there was all the wire work, climbing, and fight scenes. Though when things got really heavy-duty, duties were passed over to a stuntman. One thing Maguire did do himself, the scene in the school cafeteria where Peter catches Mary Jane's tray. It took 156 takes, and there was no CGI involved. We'd like to see Tom Holland do that. One of our favorite parts of No Way Home is the respect it shows to Andrew Garfield's take on Spider-Man. Sure, those movies had their problems, but Garfield was not one of them, and the new picture gives him the send-off he deserves. Like a Tobey before him and Tom after, Andrew was game to do his own stunts where possible. It was by far the most physical role that he had played up to that point, and the actor was happy to swing, climb, and jump as much as the filmmakers would allow. However, one thing that did require a stuntman was the skateboarding. Garfield may be an acclaimed actor, but he is no Tony Hawk. And ironically, one theoretically easy scene turned out to be unexpectedly dangerous: crossing a road. A taxi drove past at the wrong moment and clipped Garfield's foot, nearly breaking it, something that the actor said was really scary. We wonder if he now has a clause in his contract saying that he refuses to cross roads.
I can't.
We said this video would only go back 20 years, but what if we told you there were live-action Spider-Men running, jumping, and climbing around way back in the 1970s? That's right, for a brief and bizarre time, there was a live-action Japanese Spider-Man TV series which took, shall we say, a loose approach to canon? As in, it basically ignored everything about Spider-Man, except for the costume. As in, he had a giant robot shaped like a leopard? Yeah, sure, why not? Fun fact, this version of Spider-Man was finally integrated into the comics canon as part of the 2015 Spider-Verse event. One thing the show does have in common with the rest of this list is some impressive stunt work, and none of these stunts are crazier than the iconic shot of Spider-Man climbing up Tokyo Tower, used for the credit sequence. This shot involved the stuntman climbing 40 meters up the tower with no wires. Yeah, you heard that correctly. No wires of any kind. The crew just showed up, started rolling, and up he went. Hey, they were shooting 2 episodes of this show per week. Who's got time for basic health and safety?
Thanks.
Did you know Tobey Maguire was almost replaced with Jake Gyllenhaal for Spider-Man 2? The actor reportedly exaggerated the extent of a back injury in order to push for a more lucrative contract, but the studio called his bluff, firing him. Luckily, they eventually managed to patch things up. Bye, guys.